Yesterday, I read a poem from this book, Stray Subjects Arrested and Bound Over by Francis Durivage. Um, and I read quite a number of Mathew Franklin Whittier's earlier works, which simply showed that that was Mathew Franklin Whittier's style and nothing that Francis Durivage would have written. Now, I've explained that as near as I can tell, these two men, Francis Durivage and George Burnham, tricked Mathew into signing a bogus contract in 1848, which turned over the rights for Mathew's entire unpublished portfolio going back to about 1830, and that they proceeded then in the next few years to publish all of the material in that portfolio, even things that Mathew would not have published that were just sketches or practice or things that he wrote very early that he would have been embarrassed about. They published the whole blasted thing. This is very important for me to establish, not just to reclaim this rather large body of work for Mathew, but because some of the pieces in here are important in their own right in my research. For example, there's several pieces that I think are Mathew's early work, which are clearly precursors to A Christmas Carol on his end. There's some that Abby wrote that are precursors on her end. And then when they sat down to write A Christmas Carol, apparently they started by putting these earlier works together and worked from there. So the thing that Burnham and Durivage did not do was to really come up with a plausible explanation as to why they sound so similar, why their styles are so similar. Now, there's just hundreds of clues embedded in these stories that point to Mathew's authorship, which I've listed a few of them in recent blog entries. But there's no reason why they should both have these talents, because the talent in these stories and the particular talents, like for French dialect, there's no reason why both of these men would have had those talents. See, and ultimately, I think someday the whole thing is going to be, overblown because, it's going to be unnecessary because people will see that it's obviously, as I portrayed it, stolen, plagiarized work. But right now, I have to hit it hard with everything I've got in order to establish this because of the importance of it. So here we have a reprint of George Burnham's compilation, Gleanings from the Portfolio of the Young'un, because Francis Durivage took the pseudonym the Old'un, and George Burnham took the pseudonym the Young'un, and they fabricated this story that George Burnham was the protege of Francis Durivage, and that explained why their styles were so similar. Well, so far as I know, there's no independent evidence that Francis Durivage ever mentored George Burnham. And it would have had to be some pretty extensive mentoring, in order for them to both rise to this level of competence in these different styles. Matter of fact, the whole thing is absurd. It was just good enough for them to make money off it, and each of them got an editorship out of it, but it wasn't really, I don't think, ever intended to be so thoroughly plausible as to fool posterity. So that goes to why is academia still fooled? The thing is, I don't think most people care about this, So if one or two scholars have studied it, that's good enough for everybody else. Well, on page 60 of this book, Gleanings from the Portfolio of the Young'un, this is my reprint, but I'll put up Hathi Trust's photographic copy here. There is a poem called Mr. Bland and Kitty Dill, a Humorous Ballad. Okay, and this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work in his typical style. And there's no poems like this anywhere else in this book. There's no reason to believe that George Burnham, the chicken-raising con artist, would write like this or would have these kind of sensibilities in the first place. Mathew wrote in several styles, including in poetry. One of them was kind of, a whimsical romantic poetry. And there's other types where some of it was satirical, some of it was very hard-hitting social commentary. And then there was serious poetry as well, philosophical poetry, serious romantic poetry, and so on. Some of that was plagiarized as well. If you look at Geraldine's Courtship, ostensibly by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, with a few modifications that she's made, that's Mathew Franklin Whittier's own tribute to his courtship with Abby Poyen. So that's a whole different style. And of course, The Raven, which was falsely claimed by Edgar Allan Poe, that's also Mathew's style. But here we have his whimsical style, and I'm going to read this one. We don't know when it was written because, again, we're dealing with a portfolio that went all the way back to about 1830, so this could have been pretty early. But I'm going to read this one, and then I'm going to read one that appears in the October 28th, 1848 edition of the Boston Weekly Museum. Now, Mathew had a very heavy presence in the Boston Weekly Museum, which cranked up about mid-1848. And one of his signatures was Joe. Now, whether that related to his earlier character, Joe Strickland, there's one piece that Mathew signed Joe Miller Jr. Well, Joe Miller, there was a Joe Miller joke book in Europe, and I don't remember when it began, previous century, I think. So there's a long story to that. Apparently, he wasn't really the author. He was sort of a compiler, or it was done in his honor to help raise money for him or something like that. But anyway, there's a Joe Miller joke book. So whether Joe here refers to Joe Miller or whether it refers to Joe Strickland or both, I don't know. But I do know this is definitely Mathew's pseudonym. In terms of which came first, this is October 28, 1848 in the Boston Weekly Museum. This book, this compilation by George Burnham, was published in 1849, but one of the poems in here appeared in a newspaper in June of 1849, I believe it was, mid-1849. So this book, Gleanings, could not have been published prior to mid-1849. So we're talking several months difference that this poem from the museum precedes the publication of George Burnham's compilation. I've had like 3 hours sleep, so forgive me for that. All right, so I'm going to read both of these, and then I'm going to be done. There's many other poems I could bring in. I mean, I can think of some. There's one humorous poem Mathew wrote and published, I believe it was in the New York Constellation, probably around 1831 or 32, about his armchair. They had basically just recently come out with a really comfortable plush type of armchair, and he wrote a poem in praise of that. You know, there's a whole bunch of them. So, but I won't pad this any longer. This begins, I think I'll get a sip of water. Mr. Bland and Kitty Dill, a humorous ballad. Full 10 years since, I saw Miss Dill some 5 miles out of town. As I was riding up the hill, I met her coming down. Her step was light, her playful mien said, "Catch me, he who can." A lovelier face was never seen by living mortal man. "Oh, sweet Kitty, charming Kitty Dill," I said at once, "I'll marry you." Said she, "Perhaps you will." "Dearest Kitty, lovely Kitty Dill, say, wilt be mine?" She shook her head and left me on the hill. I watched her form for half a mile. She turned towards her cot. I saw her bound beyond the stile, and soon I gained the spot. I stepped within the arbor door and would have pressed her hand. I thought, so bright, so fair a flower there bloomed not in the land. "Nay, sweet Kitty, dearest Kitty Dill, I'll marry you," I said. Says she, "I don't believe you will." "Oh, sweet Kitty, lovely Kitty Dill, if thus you say, I rue the day I met you on the hill." The luscious glance of Kitty's eye had pierced quite through my heart, and though it cost a fervent sigh, I turned from her to part. I deemed that I had lost the day. A moistening filled my eye. I looked, her blue eyes seemed to say, "Poor fellow, don't you cry." "Oh, sweet Kitty, fairest Kitty Dill, you might have come some other way than over yonder hill. Say, fair Kitty, charming Kitty Dill, may I not hope?" She shook her head. I started for the hill. I reached the gate. The latch was up. I wished it might be fast. I trusted that this bitter cup, my first, might be my last. And then I turned upon my heel, I gazed toward the door, but Kitty's nerves were firm as steel. I deemed the trial o'er. Cruel Kitty, heartless Kitty Dill, adieu, I said. No more we meet when once I pass that hill. Sweetest Kitty, beauteous Kitty Dill, will you be mine? 'Tis not too late, I'll wed you if you will. I gazed in Kitty's eye once more, and thought I saw a tear. I sprang towards the cottage door, and Kitty met me there. I seized upon her snow-white hand, I clasped her gentle waist. She blushed, and said, Why, Mr. Bland, you really seem in haste. Lovely Kitty, I said, fair Kitty Dill, my heart is yours. Wilt have my hand? She said, I think I will. Bright-eyed Kitty, sweetest Kitty Dill, the knot was tied. We blessed the day we met upon the hill. Now that's sort of a caricature of love at first sight, you know. There's no indication that George Burnham, the con artist, chicken raiser, had any sensibilities like that, no less the talents, you know. So next we have An Interesting Inquiry by Joe, Boston Weekly Museum, October 28th, 1848. This is rather longish, but I think it's rather good. Did you ever, kind friend, on a midsummer's night, when the full harvest moon shone forth clearly and bright, and the sun his head laid on the rich, gorgeous breast of a bright western cloud had sunk slowly to rest, and the moon had her face with a fleecy cloud wiped when nightingales chorused and big bullfrogs piped, and the bright borealis her gleams had set forth, and balanced and chassied across the blue north, and giddily o'er the empyrean danced, while crickets chirped faintly, and fireflies glanced, and the water bugs buzzing arose from the brook, and each constellation his wonted place took in the star-spangled firmament glowing above, while musical cats warbled soft lays of love, and all nature seemed hushed in the depths of repose, like a sleeping door-bug in a large cabbage rose. Did you ever, I say, on a night like to this, sally forth for a walk with some beautiful miss? That is, some particular fair one, I mean, in your eyes the most lovely that ever was seen, some maiden whom you'd give your eye teeth to woo, whom you think about, dream of, and write verses to, whose image now haunts you in action grotesque, peers from under the ledger or over the desk, makes you err in your footings, miscalculate bills, and your poor helpless mind with queer fantasies fills, makes you sign business letters, Sophia or Sue, and perpetrate all those absurdities too, which weak lovesick youths are so apt to commit. In short, makes your brains for the least thing unfit. Did you e'er, I repeat, for the third time at least, while you suffered your eyes on her beauties to feast, resolved as you traversed the side of a ditch, your courage screwed up to the highest safe pitch, that in one short moment your fate you would know, and learn from those fair lips your weal or your woe? Did you e'er, I say for the last time, I declare, as you 'gan for your terrific task to prepare, and collecting your energies, came to a stop, resolved the momentous inquiry to pop, and screwing your face twixt a sneeze and a pout, when just as you blundered your love story out, feeling, looking, and acting as green as can be, and gracefully backing to fall on your knee, while the feeling of love seemed your senses to fuddle, step slap on a toad and fall splash in a puddle, stain your visage with filth, your proboscis with blood, and your hat in the gutter, your cane in the mud, and more than all this, to behold on that face, where lately you saw every possible grace, on those lips where you hoped love's rich draughts to quaff, first a smile, then a giggle, and lastly a laugh, which no sense of propriety e'er could keep down, no good breeding stifle, or etiquette frown, into indecent observance of usual rules, but maintained their positions as stiffly as mules? If in such a position you e'er chance to be, you can sympathize then, gentle reader, with me. So you can see the thematic similarities. My guess is that because Matthew would develop his themes and develop his ideas, that the first one I read from Gleanings, which was published by George Burnham several months later, was actually quite a bit earlier. And this one from October 48 that I just read was a more sophisticated development of the theme. See? So that just gives you some idea of what we're up against. Again, there's a great deal of importance to this because, for one thing, it's a huge body of work. And the irony is that it probably would not have been preserved had these two men not stolen it, and published it as their own. They didn't modify very much, as near as I can tell, unlike some of Matthew's other plagiarists. When Edgar Allan Poe stole Some Words with a Mummy, apparently he really reworked the thing heavily. But these guys, they've changed a few little things, but not very much. So now the only real task, because I've digitized most of this stuff now and made notes on it and so on, the only real task is just to establish that this was not actually their work, to get it back from them and claim it for Matthew. In the article that I have coming out any day now, hopefully, in Real Paranormal Magazine UK, not Real Paranormal Magazine, my article on A Christmas Carol and it having been plagiarized by Charles Dickens. Plagiarized is not quite the word because Matthew turned it over to him, see, but he took advantage. It was like stealing candy from a baby. Matthew was naive. He was in grief, and he was fooled, I would say, by Dickens' pretense to be a great philanthropist and social reformer, which I don't believe he really was. I think that was an act. So it was deception, even though Matthew technically turned the manuscript over to him. That's what I've determined. He certainly had no business, once it became as famous as it was, he had no business continuing to claim that he had written it originally, and he had no business creating this fiction about the way that he wrote it. See, it was very dishonest, the whole business. But these precursors are strong, and one of them in particular is very on target. If we establish that that was Matthew's work and not Francis Durivage's work, if we establish that this portfolio goes all the way back to 1830 and that this story therefore was very likely to have been written well before 1843 when A Christmas Carol was published, then we have such a clear precursor that you could only say one of two things. Either the real author of the precursor was the author or co-author of The Christmas Carol, or else you'd have to say that Charles Dickens heavily plagiarized this story, which is extremely unlikely. So I think it was unpublished, see, until Francis Durivage got hold of it and published it well after, 1849, whenever it was. So it's absolutely crucial to establish this particular plagiarism by Francis Durivage and George Burnham in order to establish that this precursor to A Christmas Carol was very likely written earlier. So I talk about that in this rather lengthy article that's coming out. And if you don't want to spend the money for Real Paranormal Magazine, this e-zine, you can wait for about a month and find it online on Academia EDU. So without further ado, I'm going to close this and post it, and thanks for watching.